We're going to explore the green pluralistic level of consciousness development. And I want to give a little overview why we call it pluralistic and how that is so different from this rational level of consciousness. The big insight of this pluralistic level is that our mind creates our reality. And I put in yellow here, perception of reality. People at this level think that actually really their mind creates their outside reality, and other people who think it may be a little bit more integral, they see that the mind creates the perception. And on this rational level that this green level builds on in a way, which we call postmodern because it emerged after the modern level. On the modern level, there is pretty much the idea that there is sort of like a neutral, objective subject that sees the world outside in more or less objective ways. If everybody then looks at the same object, there is the assumption that if people are rational, they see the same object, or they have the same insight, or they have the same beliefs. So rationality has this, here is a self, and there is a world out there, and this self understands the world. And with this green level, people understood more about the brain and thought about how do we actually perceive reality. And so when we perceive the world through our senses, like hearing, sight, smelling, tasting, touching, and there are a few more senses like our sense for spatial orientation and how far things are away from us. And so there are often senses that we don't think so much about, but we perceive the world, the outside world, through our senses, and even what's stored in our body sensations, it all comes up through the spinal cord. And a lot of the feelings and thoughts that come into our mind, they arise out of the amygdala and out of the hippocampus. And they get filtered through certain experiences that we had in the past. And then they reach the outer layer of the neocortex, which is, and I'll show that real quick here by stopping, which is about as thick, they say, I didn't do the research, but they say about like 6 business cards stacked on top of each other. And they're relatively thick business cards, so maybe it's even a little thinner than shown here. And then of course it's folded into this wrinkly part of the brain. And actually only the top 3 layers of the brain are really, or of the neocortex, sorry, are actually conscious. The other 3 layers, so to speak, are already unconscious of the neocortex. So these are all these insights from, of course, came out of modern science, but then modernity realized that depending on all the conditioning and the processes, everything that happens here in these unconscious parts of the brains really have a big impact how we perceive reality. And so most of you have probably seen this image here. And if you could just type into the chat window briefly what you see first when you look at this image, or what you see in this image. So when people see this for the first time, they usually either see the old woman or they see the young woman. And very often it takes quite some time for people to see the other woman. And for some people, it starts to flip back and forth. But that's a very simple example that depending on the priming that's often called of your brain, and you can even prime people by using a simpler image where you just show them the old woman, and other people you show the young woman. And then when they look for a while at the young or old woman and you show them this image where both are integrated, then they see the image that they saw before, right? So we can manipulate the brain to see what we wanted to see. And here are a few more of these optical illusions that show how our brain can be manipulated. Like at first glance, most people think that the top line is longer, or see the top line is longer than the bottom line. But then when you look more carefully, you see they're both the same length. And so this is in a way where this idea of pluralism emerged. William James talked about it, and other philosophers around the turn from the 18th to the 19th century. There's not just one view on things, but it depends on the depth or the perspective or the tools that you have to look at things. And so the people came up and became really critical of this modern worldview, right? That there is some objective way of seeing things, but they realized that the person who's observing an object or is witnessing something or perceiving something, their conditioning very much impacts on what they see. And so here finally is our screen for the green pluralistic postmodern level. And what emerged out of this level is, again, everybody in a way creates their own reality in their head, and everybody sees the world in different ways, and all these different perspectives are equally valid. Right? That's the important thing to understand about this green level. And so here we see this circle of people with different colors. Somebody said, and I sometimes say, you know, we're all like M&Ms. We have different colors, but we all taste the same. We all want to be loved. We're all human beings. So regardless of man or woman, or rich or poor, or white or non-white, or educated, non-educated, you know, any kind of differences, they're just culturally constructed. They're just made up in our minds. And ultimately, we're all the same. We're equally valuable. Everybody needs to be heard. Everybody needs to be respected. And this everybody doesn't only include humans, but also animals and all living things. And The Secret, the movie, right, which has this then extreme position that our thoughts really not only create a perception of our reality, and everybody sees reality probably slightly different or perceives it differently, but that we're actually bringing physical objects into existence. So that's my introduction to the pluralistic level. And there's, of course, thousands of books written and critiques about postmodernism, beginning with Jürgen Habermas, The Unfinished Project of Modernity, and many other books. But this is a brief introduction that helps us to understand this stage. And so today we want to continue our exploration of how and when you integrated the rational level, and when you hit a wall in the rational, or if you hit a wall, and focus on the transformation to the green level. And then what did you integrate, if you did, on the green pluralistic level of consciousness? And then you may also share a little bit about, if you transformed out of the pluralistic level, what limitations did you find here when you hit a wall in the green level? And the next week we will talk about the integral and the transpersonal level. And then we're done with our journey here in this transformational process, and the process of integration at each level and transformation to the next level. So the pluralistic level, again, is a stage like 2, 4, and 6, as we already established, where the interior surrenders to the exterior and seeks peace. And here the interior does not really surrender to like a mythic patriarchal figure or god or something like that, or a tribal leader, or fit in within the tribe, but it surrenders more like to intuition and following some guidance, right? Often the guidance is, it feels like it's inside of us, but people often go on vision quests, for example, and they listen to their feelings, but they also verify how other people feel. They don't want to, they're not egocentric or narcissistic. They're usually sharing their feelings with others and are seeking consensus with others, and they surrender to this guidance, or to the common agreements and the needs of others. So it is humanistic and non-judgmental. Right? Orange is still very judgmental, Mythic even more judgmental. So no more judgments, and it thinks in holistic terms. So we get holistic medicine and other holistic approaches to human rights and politics and all kinds of things, looking at all different parts and seeing, like a puzzle, how they somehow interact with each other and not leaving out certain parts. It's very caring, environmentally conscious. It celebrates the feminine. So if you think about it, right, this is the first stage where really emotions, care for the planet, care for others, right? These are all qualities that we usually associate with the feminine. And what it leaves behind is rationality and exploitation of others and of the planet, and wars and collateral damage and all these things, which are often associated with the masculine. And of course, the mythic is very masculine. All the gods are male figures, and there's patriarchy and things like that. So this is the first stage where the feminine, and often associated with it the female, gets elevated over the masculine and the male. Right? Everything feminine, female, good. Everything masculine, male, bad. And so a lot of men, as we will see in the feminine masculine polarity module in a few weeks, swing over to their feminine side. Not all of them, but a lot do. And then we see animal rights, like a lot of people like me became vegetarians when they enter the green stage, and sexual liberation and authentic polyamory. So here love moves from localized love on orange and mythic. There's often the idea you want to fall in love with one person, or you just love your family and love a few people. And on the green stage, love all of a sudden becomes unconditional love and becomes abundant, right? The more you love, the more love will be created. And you can not only love one human being, but you can love many human beings, or all human beings, or everything that exists, right? So this love becomes a big word. Very often that gets then extended sexually, right? If you love other people, why wouldn't you have sex with them? And why do you want to be ashamed about that or make it a secret, right? So you become open, you talk to your partner that you love other people too, and you want to have sex with them too. And this idea of polyamory emerged out of that stage. There's, of course, each stage has its own form of non-monogamy, but only on this stage, we call it polyamory, or the name polyamory emerged out of this stage. So when we will explore sexuality in module 13, we will briefly touch a little bit on different forms of non-monogamy as well. And liberates humans from greed and dogma. So greed is often associated with the orange stage, dogma with the mythic stage. And this is not so like the classical forms of communism or socialism, but more equality things of foreign aid and making sure everybody gets vaccines, and just caring about other people and supporting people so that they can become successful and equals like everybody else. And shows compassion. Right? Compassion means compassio, to suffer with others, to feel the pain of others, and then do something about it to alleviate their pain, right? Because if other people feel pain, and their pain also lives in us through the mirror neurons and through just being empathetic, then of course we want to alleviate their pain, because if they stop suffering, then we stop suffering. And that can sometimes turn into this, what's called idiot compassion. Gurdjieff apparently coined the term, where we're just showing compassion because we cannot deal with other people's pain and we're not really helping them. Explores the inner beings of self and others, right? So at this level, we become no longer so interested what other people think, but what other people feel and how they perceive the world and what their needs are. Right? So we become very sensitive to other people's inner world. And I have this friend in Northern California who, when you ask him, so Wayne, his name is Wayne, how are you? You know, Wayne would say, oh, I'm so glad that you ask. How much time do you have? Right? And you see what's coming, right? Because if you say, well, I'm actually really busy, then Wayne says, well, that really hurts me because I thought you really care about me. And then you ask me how I am, but you're not really serious. That is really hurtful, you know? Why did you do that to me? But if you say, oh, I have a few minutes, right? Then Wayne keeps talking until, you know, you really have to leave. So I'm making a bit of a joke, but sometimes, and this is real, right? I mean, he really, that was his shtick, right? How much time do you have? That's often this endless sharing of feelings and processing and emoting, right? Or oral diarrhea, whatever we want to call it, sometimes emerges at this level. And, but it's also in this case, you know, I showed sort of like the negative side. It's really important. We saw that in Same Time Next Year. If you haven't seen that movie, I highly recommend it, where we see a couple grow to these different stages. And when he gets into the green stage, he always says, well, how did that feel? You know, and what kind of unprocessed feelings are underlying there? And he's probing her constantly on her inner self. And she just goes like, you know, shut the fuck up, you know, since when are you a happy psychotherapist? I'm not in therapy here. So that's that stage. Then promotes community and unity. So we have intentional communities and shared living spaces and all kinds of drumming in the woods and women's circles and men's circles and authentic relating, right? These are all things that emerged out of this green stage where people create community, not to get more rich or more knowledgeable, but to connect on the level of their hearts and the soul and the spirit. And share society's resources among all, cares about the planet and living things. So we get all the environmental movements and human rights movements out of this stage here, reaches decisions through consensus. So that's also one of these really great things, right? Where nobody gets marginalized, nobody gets excluded any longer. So it's very, very inclusive, but sometimes, you know, that where they said, let's have a vote on if we should vote, right? So it can get very cumbersome and sometimes impractical, but it's a beautiful thing to practice this, not to exclude anyone, and refreshes spirituality and brings harmony. So in mythic, people are usually religious. In orange, they become agnostic or atheistic. And then in green, they usually become spiritual, but not religious. You probably heard that term 1,000 times, right? I'm spiritual, but not religious. And very often, of course, they get into some sanghas or centers or groups, spiritual groups, that often have very mythic leaders. And we'll talk in a moment about that green can often not clearly see what's happening there. And Richard Dawkins says, well, they're just replacing the word God with spirit, and it's just a disguised form of religion and belief in a mythic God or in a higher power, but we no longer call it God, we call it higher power or spirit or whatever else we may want to call it. And it elevates the feminine and favors matriarchy, and we get the emergence of radical and social and ecofeminism on the green stage. So feminism becomes more diverse and more engaged with society and the environment, and often in the radical form, just rejecting everything that's male or patriarchal or masculine. So there are books like Unplugging the Patriarchy. And very often they just have ideas of what to get rid of, but don't really have clear ideas what to replace it with. But sometimes they do. So first of all, we have this relativism, right? That everything is relative. And that can quickly lead to what's called moral nihilism, right? If you're no longer judging anything and everything happens for a reason and everything is as it is, and you know, it's not on us humans to judge whatever spirit or nature or evolution created, right? Then Wilber sometimes calls it the Auschwitz test, right? You can say people then, so we should not be judgmental towards Hitler and the Nazis and what happened during the Holocaust, and show compassion and so on and so forth. Not compassion for the Jews, but compassion for the Nazis. And most people then become a little uneasy. They become a little squirmy and go like, yeah, well, you know, actually, I think that was really horrible. And I have some, and then what about Trump? Oh, of course, like, yeah. And what about this, right? And you very quickly realize that it's not so easy to say everything is relative, right? But basically the idea there is that we have no moral judgment, and there is also no absolute truths. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So it often rejects modern science, even though it benefits greatly from modern science. It often rejects modern medicine and any kinds of other modern things. So as I said earlier, we get holistic medicine and more humanistic medicine and approaches to life, natural living and things like that. So often modern science gets rejected, and then that gets co-opted by people at a mythic and egocentric level as well. Self-diagnosis illnesses, for example, food allergies. So if you have some green friends over, they probably send you a long list of all their food allergies, so that you know that they can only eat raw carrots and drink water that's purified in some $200 glass container with some crystals in the bottom that do something to the water, so they don't get cancer when they drink your poisonous water that was in a plastic bottle, right? Water, plastic bottle, really bad. It needs to be glass. And if you have a cell phone, yeah, when you have a microwave, you have to put your cell phone into the microwave often so that it don't get radiated, right? And so you get all kinds of self-diagnosed or their well-informed friends, and then applies unproven natural remedies. There is endless processing and inability to reach decisions, specifically in larger groups. So I was literally in a group in Santa Rosa, Northern California, 120 people about some environmental activities. And then the speaker there said, so when should we have our lunch break? Let's have a discussion about when we're going to have our lunch break. And so some people said, no lunch break. I'm hungry now. No, let's do it in a half an hour. Let's bring in some food. No, let's, this big discussion started. And I was just watching for 20 minutes until one person got up and said, actually, I'm hungry now, I'm leaving. And then the whole room got up and everybody left for the lunch break, and that was that. So you've probably been in situations like that. Then we have this somewhat complicated pre-trans post fallacy. And if you look at these words here that are written here vertically, we see that the first three stages are called pre-conventional. The people in these stages, they haven't really learned out of their own inner awareness or complexity to follow the conventions of societies. So they're not following rules. They're just doing whatever they want. And if there are no adults there who kind of show them boundaries, they probably do harm to themselves and others. So they're pre-conventional. And then in the mythic and in the rational stage, conventions emerge. Humans create those conventions. And when people grow into these stages, they more or less follow these conventions. And if they don't follow them, they get punished, right? So mythic and rational, then they are judgmental, they put them in jail, they kill them, they do whatever. So if you're not following the convention, you're in trouble. And then the green pluralistic stage says, screw these conventions, right? We're not living by the rules of other people. We grow our own pot and we do whatever we want to do. We run around naked in the forest, or, it becomes very unconventional. We're no longer monogamous, and all these things get transcended. And that's very often positive. And so we call that post-conventional, right? That comes after the conventional stage. So we have pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional, and then post-post-conventional, We'll talk about that next week. And so the important question is what does post-conventional have in common with pre-conventional? That's a question you don't want to forget if you never asked yourself that question. And the answer is that they're both unconventional, right? Pre-conventional and post-conventional are both unconventional. And sometimes we use words like pre-personal, personal, and transpersonal, or pre-rational, rational, and trans-rational. So without going into details, so they're all loosely related with each other. So sometimes we call it the pre-post or the pre-trans fallacy. And that means that specifically green, actually, I need to go back to that slide. Here, since green rejects hierarchies, right? They treat everybody the same. They cannot tell the difference between pre-rational and trans-rational, or pre-conventional and post-conventional. And that has the effect that green people often fall in love, right? Being post-conventional with people who are pre-conventional. And I'll explain that a little bit more why when we look at this feminine masculine polarity stuff here in a few weeks. But for now, it should suffice to recognize that sometimes when that happens, right, a post-conventional person finds a pre-conventional person very attractive, very sexy, and maybe also see them as victims. And so they want to rescue them and help them and have compassion for them. And that's a very lovely thing until this egocentric or magical person starts to take the freedoms, the liberties away and abuses sexually, financially, emotionally the green person and exploits them, for example, by cheating or by taking their money or, beating them, being physically aggressive and things like that. And they're often quite clever then when the green person, says, I'm really hurting and stop doing that, or why do you violate our agreements and things like that. They may say, oh, I thought you're so spiritual. I thought you're so non-judgmental. I thought you're so evolved. Why do you have a problem that I sleep with your best friend, or that I spent your money, or that I, totaled your car, or something like that? If you would be so spiritual and so evolved, then you wouldn't have a problem with that. And then the green person often feels very guilty and shame for not being able to deal with the reality of their partner who's pre-conventional, and they never figure out really what the hell is going on until they talk to someone like you or me who is aware of this dynamic. And then they go like, maybe there are actually some developmental stages. I see now what the hell is going on. And that's often the first step for green people actually to move into integral, when they're sick and tired of red and magic people who are pre-conventional to invade their post-conventional communities or relationships and friendships and destroy them or create a lot of havoc there. Green often says there are no absolute truths, right? And we probably, in the first module, we had a question, how do you know what is absolutely true? And most people say, well, you can't know, there is no absolute truth. But then if you ask green, well, is that an absolute truth, that there are no absolute truths, right? It gets a little slippery because now they don't know what to say. Well, if that's not an absolute truth, well, you get the idea, right? It creates a contradiction in itself, or a paradox, or mental cognitive dissonance. And then if they say, yes, that's an absolute truth, then of course you can say, well, so we have one absolute truth. Are there any other absolute truths? And it gets the conversation then either gets interested, or green says, Martin, that's actually your problem. You're too much in your head, right? That's why we don't like you here. You have to be in your heart, and you ask all these questions that don't make any sense because you're too rational. And you're a man, and that's actually the problem. You have to connect with your inner energy and your compassion in your heart, right? So that's usually their argument. You're too much in your head. Become non-rational. Rational is not good. That's the problem, rationality. So That's why we sometimes feel a little miffed when we become integral about green, because they like everyone but us. And then they're also non-judgmental, right? So they say, Martin, you shouldn't be so judgmental. And then when I say, well, but it seems like you're quite judgmental towards me by judging me for being judgmental, again, you get this like, you're too much in your head kind of response. Or, I don't think we don't know how to talk to you. I'm not sure if we like you around here, right? Get this kind of thing. And then no hierarchies are better than hierarchies. Oh, that's interesting. Is that a hierarchy, that you just created a hierarchy by saying having no hierarchies is better than having hierarchies? That sounds like a hierarchy to me, that one thing is better than the other. Oh, yeah, you're too much in your head. And then they include and love and accept everyone. So these green groups usually are very welcoming. Everybody's welcome here: gay, lesbian, black, brown, white, LGBTQ. Everybody's welcome here, and we're all loving and we love everyone. But if you dare not to love everyone in these groups, then you get kicked out faster than you can count to 3. So that's also often a challenge there. So we're all inclusive, except for the people who don't want to include everyone or don't love anyone. And what would you like to co-create on the green level, whatever is still alive in you? Do you want to have an open polyamorous relationship, or do a lot of emotional work with your partner, or share join an intentional community? And how do you want to take care of your body and things like that? What's there from the green level?